Hi, everybody. Today, I want to talk about spiritual gifts, your spiritual gifts, our spiritual gifts. Remembering the abilities that we were never taught to trust. Yesterday I spent some time with a friend who is very, very psychic, like super multi-dimensionally connected all the time, and it's amazing to spend time with her. And I don't consider myself to be psychic the way that she is, but being around her made me aware of my own spiritual gifts. And I started thinking about it. A lot of us have these gifts and we don't necessarily recognize them because a lot of the time when people hear the phrase spiritual gifts, they often imagine something extraordinary like psychics and mediums and remote viewers and healers and think, well, that's not me, But what if many of the gifts that are already active are just gifts that we've been taught not to recognize, right? Maybe they're just part of your wallpaper baked into you. And so I thought it would be worth a second look at this and also how we get wounded around our spiritual gifts because they're not validated. So I don't know about you, but I spent much of my life thinking that intelligence looked a certain way, right? Good test scores and fast answers and linear and logical reasoning. And of course, it's easy to understand why we see it that way because that is how our educational system is based, right, through academic validation. And yet I always knew that there was another kind of knowing operating in me, and I was often very frustrated that it didn't seem to be reflected in my scores. I remember, especially around the time of the SATs and, when I was getting ready to leave high school and applying to colleges and everything, I was frustrated because I felt like the depth of my intelligence was never reflected by the test taking or the test administration. And it wasn't until I got to philosophy class in freshman year at Duke that I started to understand that, that's more the direction of my particular kind of intelligence, and it sort of shed a light on how our culture tends to validate only certain forms of intelligence and dismiss intuition and feeling and direct knowing and energetic perception as being untrustworthy. Well, it's no surprise with the world that we live in, and I keep talking about this suppression of the heart by the mind and the imbalance that we've been dealing with for so many thousands of years, and it's just another expression of that. So what spiritual gifts actually are? Well, there's something that belongs to all human beings. We all have them. And I don't think that we should think of them as supernatural. I think they're natural. They're natural. They're simply aspects of human perception that have been neglected or suppressed deliberately and therefore forgotten by us. A spiritual gift is simply a way that consciousness receives information. And it's worth paying attention to how you receive information. Now, currently they want to replace the way that we receive information with all the AI, right? But we don't need that. We have direct connection, right? And so I thought it would be useful to look at the gifts that we already have that we may not be recognizing that we have. The first one, and see if you can recognize yourself here. The first gift I want to talk about is claircognizance. Claircognizance, that is that feeling of, I just know. I don't know how I know. I just know. There's no evidence. There's no logical chain. There's just knowing, right? And people who require proof often make claircognizant people doubt themselves or feel foolish. And since this is one of my big gifts, I understand how hard that can be on your self-esteem. Once you doubt yourself, you can start to lose touch with your natural ways of knowing. And here's the thing. The suppression of spiritual gifts is rarely dramatic. It is something that happens in really ordinary moments. A child knows something, a child feels or perceives something, and then the adults around them can't receive it. Not because they're cruel, just because they themselves have been conditioned into a reality where only certain forms of knowing are considered valid, trustworthy, right? And so there's a wound there, I think, for most of us, right? A wound around the unreceived gift, right? And I think many of you listening will recognize this immediately in your own life, that feeling of I know, and then prove it, right? And because the knowing didn't arrive through logic, because it didn't arrive through a chain of evidence, because it arrived whole as you're knowing, you suddenly feel that you're unable to defend it after you know it. Right? And, we could call this the claircognizance dilemma. Like a claircognizant person often cannot show their work, right? And in school, you're always taught you have to show your work, right? So it's as though the answer arrives before the equation, like you're handed the complete puzzle, you're handed the answer, and then someone says, well, show me how you put it together. And you can't, because you didn't. You simply received it. Does that feel familiar to anybody? And, this is where the suppression begins. Not because logic is bad. Logic is a beautiful tool, and we need to know how to avail ourselves of logic and use logic, definitely. But when logic is the only permitted language, well, then other very valuable forms of intelligence become invalidated. And so when I think back to those feelings of like frustration in my environment as a young person growing up and as a into my adult years, like it wasn't that my knowing was wrong, it was that my knowing didn't speak the dominant language and I didn't know how to explain my knowing. So that's for claircognizance. Let's talk about clairsentience. Clairsentience is you feel, right? You just walk into a room and you sense tension or sadness or joy or deception or, something. You sense things. You feel people. You feel their feelings without anybody saying a word, right? A lot of people are clairsentient on a collective level too. We feel things happening in the collective, but we don't know how to tease out like what's ours, why am I feeling this way? Everything was fine. This morning I wake up and I'm like, where does it come from? Well, if nobody's ever taught you what these spiritual gifts are that we all share in, you don't have a language for understanding how you receive information. Then there's clairaudience, right? Clairaudience doesn't necessarily mean hearing voices. It is phrases arriving or insights arriving as words. It's like a knowing through language or through sound. And then clairvoyance, right? Again, not necessarily visions. It could be symbolic imagery. It could be dreams. It could be perception of energy through your eyes. It could be, visual knowing. I mean, when I was my first year at Juilliard, when I was, in acting training, I have this very clear memory of all of the hours that we spent lying on the floor, breathing in every conceivable position, because you're learning how to open up your rib cage so that you can have a big breath that will support a voice on stage. At least that's how it used to be at Juilliard. I don't know if it's like that now, but many, many hours spent on the floor breathing. developing breath capacity. And I spontaneously, my first year at Juilliard, started seeing energy around people, started feeling energy in my hands, right? And the funny thing is, I didn't go, wow, what's happening to me? It wasn't like super weird or anything. I was like, oh, that must be auras. Was not a big deal. And I feel like that natural ability was brought back in because of all of the breath work that I was doing. Well, I tried to tell my dad about this on my break home from school my first year at Juilliard, and my beloved dad, who's been gone very many years now, he was a psychiatrist. His world was built upon a particular model of reality, and so then his daughter comes home saying, I can see energy around people. That doesn't fit. And when something doesn't fit, then people often reject the experience rather than expand the model, right? And our conclusion as children or as young people, the tragedy is that most often the child doesn't conclude, well, maybe my parents have limitations. They conclude something must be wrong with me. That's wrong, right? And then we take in this split that we see in the outer world, this split between the mind and the heart, and the dominance of the mind over the heart, and we take that in internally, right? And it becomes part of us. We internalize that. And the mind begins suppressing the heart, right? Not because the heart is wrong, but because its belonging feels more important than truth. Especially when you're young, right? It's hard to be the only one going against the grain, right? That's why I'm always so in awe of people who really are able to do that, have been able to do that kind of courage. That's something that I've had to learn later in life. It was not natural to me because we live in an unnatural world. So then what happens? A person starts doubting, and it happens so young, right? We start doubting intuition and perception and feeling and knowing, and eventually we lose some access to it, not because the gift disappears, but because our trust in the gift disappears. Most gifts are not suppressed by force, they are suppressed by doubt. Other people's doubt, and then our own doubt that we take in, right? So we know that our gifts are also deliberately suppressed. I mean, if you're awake and aware in this world today, if you are aware of the degree of mind control that is perpetrated and that everybody is under to some degree, then you know that our gifts are suppressed. A society that, and we don't even have to talk about the way that things are actually run to understand that a society that values conformity and external authority and measurable outcomes is going to naturally discourage intuition, inner knowing, direct perception. I mean, a person who trusts their inner knowing is not controllable. And the truth is if you begin to access and to trust your natural spiritual gifts, then you cannot be exploited, as you will remember who you are. So you are not going to be a useful cog in their machine. So, you'll see through the matrix, you'll understand the nature of reality, and you won't give your power away to it anymore. So that is why so much of what we are has been suppressed. Okay. And then there's this other piece of it, I guess, which is like misdiagnosis, I guess we could call it. Many gifts are labeled imagination, extra sensitivity, anxiety, overthinking, weirdness, some kind of psychological disorder, or you're making that up, right? You just get the flat out disbelief of somebody who cannot take in that version of reality. And, we remember in our DNA and in our being, other times when our gifts and the free expression of our gifts cost us dearly. And even today, I've spoken to survivors who, when they tried to heal by going through the conventional systems, mental health, psychiatric systems, they were, an inch away from being institutionalized and put on medication. And, that would have been the end of that, right? And then you have to get yourself out of that system. So it hasn't been a very safe place for us to find a natural expression of our spiritual gifts. But, and there's always a but, our gifts are beginning to return, or maybe it's part of our awakening and the flourishing of human consciousness and the way that things are flourishing, despite all the stuff that is going on in the world, and despite all the fear porn and all of the, if you pay attention to that stuff, then you'll only see things in a certain angle. Despite all of that, our gifts are returning. And many people think that they have to develop their gifts, but maybe it's more a question of removing the interference. These gifts often emerge through healing and nervous system regulation and embodiment and authenticity, just being yourself, spending time in nature, coming back to heart coherence, right? The truth is, the more whole we become, the clearer we're able to perceive, the more we're able to receive, right? So again, healing is a big, big part of all of this. Awakening isn't just seeing the world differently. It's perceiving differently. As the veil lifts externally, it lifts internally, and vice versa. The more you remove the veils from your being, right? The more you become whole. In other words, you take in the parts of you that had been separated, fragmented away from you for one reason or another. You bring all your parts home. Then you become whole, right? And the more you become whole, the more you see holistically what is the nature of reality. And there's also a piece of it that is validation, right? We need to validate one another in our gifts. And this is something, that, again, what got me thinking about this was spending time with a friend yesterday who is super duper psychic, and but in having her validate my way of receiving information, validation is a kind of medicine, because for centuries we've been taught that, trust the expert, trust the authority, trust the institutions. But spiritual gifts begin with a totally different proposition, which is trust your own experience, trust your own knowing, not blindly, not arrogantly, respectfully, right? And many people don't need development. They need validation so that we can learn to recognize how we perceive and how we receive information. And there are many, many different ways that occurs, right? Sometimes the gift doesn't need to be stronger. It just needs to be trusted. Then you start recognizing, oh, that's my feeling of knowing. I just never really trusted it before. What if I started trusting it, right? What if the things that you've spent your life dismissing or doubting, your intuition, your sensitivity, your knowing, your feeling, are actually your greatest gifts? And so I think I want to just sort of ask a question, put a question into the field, right? What did you know as a child that other people talked you out of? Or that, right? What did you know? Maybe it wasn't seeing energy. Maybe it was, wasn't anything, spectacular or, immediately remarkable. Maybe it was. Maybe it was more about creativity and sensitivity and empathy and imagination and connection to animals, connection to nature, feeling other people's emotions, whatever it was, what sort of do you remember knowing that you then started to doubt and lost connection with? I'm sure that we all have a fairly long list. Maybe part of awakening to our gifts is simply remembering when we stopped trusting in them. You don't need to become more spiritual. You need to just become more yourself. Don't be afraid of being yourself. And I don't mean that in the sense of the personality and the ego. I mean what is within you, right? Bring forth what is within you. That is real. That is authentic. That's, being spiritual is just another role. If that's not real. It's being you that matters. And the more you can be, without apology for your gifts, the more whole you become, and the more your gifts naturally begin to pour forth. The more you begin to trust them, the more you begin to remember them, and the more the world benefits from them, because they're not here just to be, for you alone. They're here to serve the great awakening for your contribution to the world. Your contribution is you being fully yourself. And that's where you'll see the flourishing of your spiritual gifts. I think that's all that I want to cover today. I appreciate your presence. I appreciate your openness. And I'd love to hear what you feel your spiritual gifts are. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.